John Dryden, Batavia Lyceum Association. This is where I came in. I think, thank you for coming. We're very excited to see you. We're here the second Monday of every month, at least during the school year. Art historians, local historians, reference historians, artists, singers, physicists, all kinds of really smart people talk about really smart stuff right here in this room, which is a tavern, which is how God meant it to be. We have a donation jar. We asked $5 from everybody. If you can do it, we pay a stipend to our speakers, those who will take it. We give some of that in gift certificates to this fine establishment. Ryan and Melissa, this is their day off. They come in and open it up for us. And they're awesome people. And we've got other awesome people that executively produce this, like Alina Grace, and other producers like my friend Mark, who's on the board, who brought us this awesome speaker. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Mark so he can explain this really cool cat he brought us.
Hi, Mark Kolevka. I've worked with Valerie for quite a few years, until I retired a couple of years ago. Valerie came to the lab in 2012 and was a great acquisition for us. She came as our lab archivist and historian. She has a bachelor's degree in English with a minor in history from Illinois Wesleyan, and she has her Master of Library Science. Yes, library is a science, with a specialization in archives and records management, which is serving her very well at the lab. She has that degree from Indiana University. Prior to joining Fermilab, she was the assistant archivist at the Chicago Institute of Art. So very prestigious. So without further ado, I'll turn you over to Valerie. Thank you.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Let me simply here really quick. Try to figure out how I'm going to juggle this. Oh man. Okay, can everybody hear me? Is that close enough to the
I think they're all close.
Okay. Maybe, all right. How is that? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, okay, sounds good. All right, so as Mark said, I am Valerie Higgins. I'm Fermilab's archivist and historian. I've been there since 2012, and thank you so much for coming to hear me speak about this. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the history of Fermilab, and I am going to focus somewhat on the history of women at the lab, kind of woven into that larger story. So what is Fermilab? Well, Fermilab is the United States Particle Physics and Accelerator Laboratory. And the scientists at the lab try to answer fundamental physics questions like, what are we made of? How did the universe begin? And what secrets do the smallest, most elemental particles of matter hold? And how can they help us understand the intricacies of space and time? So this is pretty exciting work going on. This is just the lab's vision and mission statements that go into that in a little bit more detail. The lab is the only national lab that is devoted exclusively to particle physics in the national lab system. It is run by the Department of Energy and has over 2,100 employees. And it collaborates with many different institutions in many different countries. It's a very international place. Physically, the lab is a 6,800-acre site, of course, here in Batavia. And this is an aerial view of the site, and I just want to draw your attention to that large ring. There's actually two rings that you can see on there. Those are both accelerators that you will hear more about later in the talk. And one of the main ways the scientists at the lab do their work is by using accelerators. Accelerators are large, complex machines that basically allow scientists to study particles, which are the fundamental components of matter. And to give you a sense of scale, that accelerator is about 2 miles around. This is something you'll see a few times during this talk. This is something called the Standard Model. It's basically a representation of the fundamental particles and forces that make up the universe. So Fermilab actually started in 1967, but I'm going to start with some prehistory about the lab, give you a sense of how it started, where it came from, and why. So the first step in the prehistory was this Ramsey panel. So this was a panel organized by the Atomic Energy Commission. The Atomic Energy Commission was basically the predecessor to today's Department of Energy. So they organized this panel that was headed by Norman F. Ramsey. He was a prominent physicist who in 1989 would win the Nobel Prize in Physics. And the reason this panel was organized was that at the time there were many different potential accelerators being discussed for the United States, many different places that these accelerators might be based. There were just a lot of ideas out there. And this panel was organized to decide what the priorities should be for the field of high energy physics in the United States in the coming decades. So they completed their report in April of 1963, and in this report, one of their recommendations was that the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, California, build an accelerator with an energy of 200 GeV. You'll hear me say GeV, BeV, sometimes it's the same thing, and it's basically just a measure of energy of the accelerator. So obviously this lab would ultimately not be built in California, but this is one of these steps in the prehistory. The next step in the prehistory of the lab was the emergence of this idea of the truly national laboratory. So this emerged at a meeting at Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York. This was a meeting of physicists, and a prominent physicist named Leon Letterman presented a paper titled "A Possible High-Intensity, High-Energy Accelerator, the Truly National Laboratory." And in it, Letterman laid out what he saw as the ideal characteristics of an accelerator laboratory. And in particular, he imagined a laboratory that was geared towards outside users. This was in contrast to a lot of the accelerator laboratories at the time, like Brookhaven, Berkeley. They tended to favor users from those institutions. So if you were at those institutions and you had an idea for an experiment, great. You were probably going to be able to use the accelerators, but if you were not at those institutions, it might be hard for you to get access to those accelerators to perform experiments. So the idea was there would be a national accelerator laboratory that all potential users could have access to. Letterman would, of course, play an important role in the history of the lab. He was one of the important early users of the lab, and he later became the lab's second director. The next stage was this Berkeley design study. So Berkeley produced Lawrence Radiation Laboratory produced a design study for a 200 GeV accelerator. It was lengthy, detailed, and expensive. It was in fact significantly more expensive than originally had been budgeted by the AEC for this project. And some of the reason for that was that they wanted reliable performance, they wanted rapid construction, predictable costs, so there weren't risks taken in this design, but because of that, it was more expensive. So the next thing that this planned lab needed was some sort of organization to run it. So in January of 1965, the National Academy of Sciences sponsored a meeting of presidents from 25 major research universities to discuss how this 200 GeV facility would be managed. And at the meeting, they decided to form an organization called Universities Research Association, URA. The group was incorporated in June of 1965 and held its first annual meeting in November of that year. And Norman Ramsey, who I mentioned from the Ramsey panel, he became president of URA in 1966. So at this point, it was no longer a given that this lab would be located in Berkeley. So the AEC decided to hold a nationwide site competition. There was a lot of competition, a lot of interest in hosting this new lab. The AEC established site criteria, so these sites would be evaluated on things like proximity to major research institutions, a little bit like how easy it was for scientists around the country to get to the location, whether there are adequate utilities, what the cost of construction would be in that location, all these factors were considered. And they ultimately received over 200 proposed sites in 46 different states. So there were a lot of places this could potentially have been, but what the site that was selected was Weston, Illinois, this little town that you see here. It was started in the early 1960s, had about 400 residents at the time. And if you're familiar with Fermilab, you might recognize kind of that layout, because what that is now is what we call the Fermilab Village. And basically many of the streets and many of these little houses have been preserved, and they continue to be used for housing and lab space and things at the lab. So the Atomic Energy Commission announced the choice of Weston in December of 1966. And this is Glenn Seaborg, the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, the governor of Illinois, all at Weston when it was visited as part of the site selection process. This is what the site looked like when it was originally chosen. So there were farmhouses, barns. Again, many of these actually have been preserved and are still on the lab site because you saw that little town, but of course the whole site is 6,800 acres. So there are also all these farms and farmhouses. So the next thing that the lab needed was a director. And the Atomic Energy Commission's choice of Robert Wilson for this role would have a huge impact on the future of the lab. His selection was announced on March 1st, 1967, and he would be the lab's director until 1978. At the time he was selected, he was director of the Laboratory for Nuclear Studies at Cornell University. And his importance to the history of the lab really can't be overstated. His philosophy and priorities shaped the philosophy and priorities of the lab as a whole, and his personality left a stamp on the culture of the lab that you really can still see there today. His first contact with this 200G in Italy in September of 1965, he saw the Berkeley scientists present their plan, and he thought that it was over-designed, uncreative, and too costly. And he said that a few times. And so at first people were not that receptive to these criticisms. It's were more limited, and that original Berkeley design study could no longer be built as it had been planned. If it was going to be built in that way, the capabilities of the accelerator were going to have to be reduced. But Wilson had an interesting background. I mentioned he was at Cornell. He was available to direct this lab because he had just recently completed an accelerator project at Cornell ahead of schedule, under budget. And so he said that he could do something similar for this planned lab. He said he could deliver a 200 GeV accelerator within the allotted budget, and that he could deliver an expandable accelerator, basically one that could easily be modified to eventually reach higher energies. He had a very interesting background. Wilson was born in 1914. He grew up in Frontier, Wyoming. When he was younger, he was largely self-educated. He worked on the Manhattan Project, and he was actually the youngest group leader on the Manhattan Project. He was a talented sculptor. You can see him working on a sculpture there. So after Wilson was selected, it was shortly afterwards that the lab began its operations. In early 1967, that Weston site was actually not yet ready. And so the lab's first offices were on the 10th floor of a building in Oak Brook. You might recognize this building if you've driven on I-88. It's actually still there. It looks a little bit different now, and there's two buildings. There's a matching building now, but that is where the lab's original offices were. And so on June 15th, 1967, about 18 people arrived to work at these NAL offices. You'll hear me say NAL because that's NAL, it stands for National Accelerator Laboratory, because the lab originally was called the National Accelerator Laboratory, and it only later became Fermilab. And those 18 people that I mentioned that were there on that first day of work, 2 of them were women. There was Jean Muniak and Minerva Sanders, who were both administrative assistants. So one of the first things that the lab employees had to do was they had to create a design report for this planned accelerator. And so they worked on that in 1967, and then in January of 1968, that design report was completed. And it was later that year, in September of 1968, that the lab completed its move to the Weston site. Here you can see the flag raising ceremony in front of what were the director's first offices in one of those little buildings in what we now call the village. It was also in 1968 that the lab released its policy statement on human rights, and I think this provides some interesting context for the history of women at Fermilab. This statement indicates that the lab was committed to equal employment opportunity and to creating an environment that respected human rights and dignity, but it does only specifically mention men at this point. But that would change in 1974. The policy statement was updated to also highlight the challenges that women had faced in the workplace, and to explicitly say that the statement was intended to apply to all people, including women. A quick look at these first few pages from the spring 1969 Fermilab Employee Directory shows us that women played a variety of roles at the lab. And if you look at some numbers from that initial directory, you can see the majority of women at the lab did have roles like clerk or secretary or administrative assistant, but there were some exceptions. There was a woman who was a programmer in that 1969 directory. There was assistant draftsman, assistant for art and design, editor. So you do see some of that variety. There's some women at work at Fermilab in 1968 and 1969. That person in the center, Minerva Sanders, she's one of those people who was present on that first day of the lab's operations. Another interesting role that was largely played by women in the early days of the lab was the film analysis facility scanners. This requires a little bit of explanation of what this work was, and these roles weren't filled exclusively by women, but many of them were. So Fermilab had a particle detector that was called the bubble chamber. That detector was in operation from 1973 to 1988, and basically what this did, it was filled with a liquid, and particles would enter the detector, and as they moved through, they would leave little trails of bubbles, and they would create these beautiful spirals that you see in lines that you see in that bubble chamber image. But the tricky thing was the detector would produce thousands and thousands of these images, and to find the relevant images, somebody had to look at them. And so under the guidance of the scientists, the scanners would look for paths that had particular angles, or they would look for certain shapes, and it would basically indicate that a particle or an interaction that the scientists were interested in was present in that image. So I've been, at this point, emphasizing some of the different roles that women played at the lab during this time, besides administrative support roles, but by doing that I don't want to downplay the importance of administrative support. Both then and now, these administrative support positions are often the backbones of their department, and I found that as a historian I do oral history interviews, and it's interviews with longtime administrative assistants that have sometimes been among my most valuable interviews. Some of these people have been very long-serving employees at the lab and really know a lot about the history. Just a couple examples of that are, these are some people that worked for a very long time at the lab. There was Pat Olek, who started in 1968 and retired in 2014. There was Barb Kristen, who started in 1967 and retired in 2018. So, really a long history with the lab. And I particularly like that 1970 photo of Barb because she appears to be soldering something. So, that kind of tells you that, even if your title was secretary in the employee directory, you still might be doing all kinds of other things, especially in the early days of the lab. So the next major milestone in the history of the lab was the lab's groundbreaking. That happened on December 1st, 1968. It was actually the groundbreaking for the LINAC, or the Linear Accelerator. This was the first part of the accelerator complex. You can see they did not have great weather for this groundbreaking. This is what it might look like here tomorrow. But they still did seem to get a good turnout. There were a lot of people from the community present, and a lot of lab staff as well. And in a moment here, you'll see Robert Wilson speaking at the event, and then also Glenn Seaborg, chair of the Atomic Energy Commission. They take a shovel and turn the first shovel full of dirt that marks the beginning of construction of the lab. And we actually still have this shovel in the archives as one of our artifacts. So there you can see the beginning of construction of the lab. And those are just a few more images from the day. So the next milestone was the main ring groundbreaking. They had better weather for this groundbreaking. It was October 3rd of 1969, kind of a better time of the year. Robert Wilson is standing in the middle of that picture with his arm raised, and it's a little bit hard to see, but I've been told that he's actually holding up a worm that he's found as they've been digging in the soil. I can't 100% confirm that, but that's what I've been told. So if you remember that big circle that I showed on the site, on that aerial view, this is that circle, that main ring taking shape. So the main ring was the main accelerator of the lab, and that is the accelerator that would be this 200 GeV accelerator, the reason the lab was being built. It consisted of over 1,000 magnets, and these magnets were used to basically take these particles called protons, these fundamental particles, and speed them up to very high energies. And then the scientists could use these particles and interactions of these particles to perform experiments. And here you can see the construction of that accelerator. So of course, anytime you have a project this big and this complicated, and then remember, Wilson had promised to deliver this within a tight budget, so there were a number of decisions that were made about the design that made some aspects of that more challenging, some aspects of the construction more challenging. And so they did run into some problems with some of the magnets failing early on, and they had to figure out how to fix that. One issue that they ran into was there were some tubes that had some construction debris in them, like little metal shavings and things like that. And someone had the idea to address this by getting a ferret and putting a harness on the ferret and tying a string to it and sending it through the tube with the idea that you could then tie a cleaning swab to the end of the string and pull it through to clear out the tube. So this was Felicia the ferret, and they did actually use her to clean out some test sections and things, and it was a very popular story. It received a lot of coverage in newspapers. The lab did ultimately develop a mechanical device to do this. A mechanical device that actually did most of this work, but Felicia is still a great story and much beloved. So there's some more images of the main ring construction. There's some people in the mouth of the tunnel, which kind of gives you a sense of the scale. So despite some of those challenges, the main ring was completed. The last magnet was put in place on April 16th of 1971. And then in 1972, on March 1st, the accelerator achieved its design energy of 200 GeV. And it was still completed ahead of the original schedule and within the allotted budget. And here you can see some of the celebrations in the main control room when that milestone was achieved. And as planned, 200 GeV was only the beginning for the main ring accelerator. It quickly surpassed that original design energy, reaching 300 GeV in July of that year, and in 1976 it would reach 500 GeV. Robert Wilson, of course, had been a very big part of this, and he received the National Medal of Science in 1973 for his work on the main ring. And I just want to wrap up my discussion of that day with one of my favorite images from that day. You can see on the screen it says 200 GeV, hip hip hooray. So it was actually a little bit before the accelerator achieved its design energy that the lab's experimental program began. That began when the experiment E36 began taking data in February of 1972. And this experiment, I think, is noteworthy not just for being the first experiment to take data, but interestingly, it was a collaboration between US and Soviet scientists during the Cold War, which I think really shows how important international collaboration has been really since the beginning of the lab. And international collaboration has only become more important to the lab as time has gone on. So once the accelerator was up and running, there was an internal target area where experiments could be performed. There were also these fixed target experimental areas, the meson area, neutrino area, and proton area. And interestingly, each of these areas has a distinctive structure that's associated with it. And I like to show these because I feel like they look maybe a little different than the kind of structures you'd expect to find at a science lab. And that really is something that is part of Robert Wilson's influence. So I mentioned that Wilson was a sculptor as a hobby. He had an art journal that we have in the archives, and these are like some examples from his art journal. And he created sculptures for the lab. You can see him working on one of them here. And then you can see those two of his sculptures near the central laboratory building, which is now named Wilson Hall in his honor. And if there's any sculpture of his that you're familiar with, it's probably broken symmetry. If you visited the lab, you've likely driven under this sculpture. Even if you haven't visited the lab, if you've driven down Kirk Road, you've probably seen it from the road. And Wilson was very interested in architecture. In fact, he says in his drafts for his memoirs that one of his requirements for taking the position of lab director was that he be given fairly free rein on the architecture as long as he stayed within the allotted budget. And he was very excited about this opportunity to shape the physical environment of the lab. And these are just a couple of quotes from him about that. So Wilson was not himself the architect of Wilson Hall, but he did have a lot of influence on it. He was inspired by the shape of cathedrals in France and the way they sort of stood out on the landscape. He was inspired by the Ford Foundation building in New York, and he gave a lot of input to the design of the building. So here you can see construction began in 1971. You can see it taking shape there. You can see some plans and designs for it. And then it was completed in 1973. So another way that Wilson indirectly influenced the aesthetics of the lab was by hiring someone named Angela Gonzalez. She was the lab artist for many years, and she was actually employee number 11. So she was the 11th person hired, which I think is just fascinating that this was such a priority. Wilson had worked with her previously at Cornell, and so that was how important this was to him, that we had this lab artist from the beginning of the lab, and she was the lab artist until 1998 when she retired. So Angela Gonzalez selected the lab's bold color scheme of bright blues, oranges, and reds. You'll still see that in many places at the lab. She also designed the iconic logo, which is actually a combination of the shapes of two types of magnets, dipole and quadrupole magnets, that were used in the accelerator. And you can see how she played with them and merged them to create this logo. She also created these really beautiful pieces of artwork for lab publication covers, for posters for events. And that's something that really is, as far as I know, unique to Fermilab. I've not seen other national labs having this kind of artwork on their publication. So it's really a nice part of the lab's history. So in addition to bringing attention to the sort of aesthetic aspects of the lab, Wilson also brought an interest in the natural environment of the lab. For instance, he discouraged the unnecessary cutting down of trees. He actually rerouted some roads on the site to avoid having to cut down some of the most impressive trees. Of course, I can't talk about the history of Fermilab without mentioning the bison. If there's one fact that people tend to know about Fermilab, it's about the bison, that we have a herd of bison at the lab. So the first bison came to the lab in late 1969. It started with 6 animals that were purchased from Colorado. The next year, more animals were brought in from a herd in Illinois. And bringing the bison to the lab site was, in part, it was related to this idea of restoring some of the original natural environment of the site, but it was also part of this idea that was very common, especially at that time, that science was the new frontier. And so you'll see a lot of frontier imagery and frontier terminology pops up in the early history of the lab. And of course, we still have the bison at the lab today. You can still see them. There's a lot of restored tallgrass prairie at the lab, and that's an effort that began in 1967, initiated by someone named Dr. Robert Betts, with the support of Wilson. So the prairie, the restoration efforts began within the main ring, and then, by the late 1980s, the lab had one of the largest restored prairies in the world, and still has a lot of restored prairie today. So to get back to kind of the main chronological sequence, shortly after Wilson Hall was completed, the lab held its dedication ceremony on May 11th, 1974. And this was when NAL officially became Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, or Fermilab. And internal publications almost immediately started using the term Fermilab. So that's when that name comes for the lab. It was named after physicist Enrico Fermi. Many of you are probably familiar with him. He was a very well-known and influential theoretical and experimental physicist. He'd spent a lot of his time at the University of Chicago, so this was considered an appropriate person to name the lab after. Enrico Fermi, of course, was no longer alive at this time, but his widow, Laura Fermi, did come and speak at the dedication. One of the lab's first major scientific milestones was the discovery of the bottom cork by E288, and that paper announcing that discovery was received by publishers on July 1st of 1977. One of the leaders of this team was Leon Letterman, who I've already mentioned in connection with that truly national lab idea. And so I want you to note here the size of this team. I don't know if this is necessarily everybody on the experiment, but it gives you a sense of the scale, and you can see how over the history of the lab, the scale of these experiments will really change and grow much larger. So this experiment discovered the bottom cork, and on this standard model, that's the one that represents the bottom cork. So you might have noticed that in those images, that team and also that previous E36 experiment did appear to be all men, but there were more opportunities that arose for women at the lab as time went on. One of these places was in the neutron therapy facility. So the neutron therapy facility was a cancer treatment facility that existed at the lab from 1976 to 2013 and treated over 3,000 patients. And Arlene Lennox was an important part of that. She had come to the lab in 1974 as a physicist. She became part of the neutron therapy facility in 1985, and she ultimately became head of that facility. The next phase in the lab's history was what was originally called the energy doubler. It was also sometimes called the energy saver. You'll probably know it better as what eventually became known as the Tepatron. So this is a drawing of that planned doubler by Angela Gonzalez, that artist I mentioned earlier. So as early as the summer of 1967, very early in the lab's history, Wilson was already talking to his staff about the possibility of one day upgrading the main ring accelerator using a technology called superconducting magnets, which would basically allow for a more powerful accelerator. And so when they were building the main ring, they deliberately left enough space in the tunnel to allow for this future upgrade. So the day after the main ring achieved its design energy on that March 1st, 1972, the very next day, the lab began to officially work on energy doubler efforts. And it was in 1976 that the lab first held meetings discussing the idea of having a collider as part of the accelerator. And the collider, that basically meant that you would have two beams of particles within the accelerator. You would collide them together and produce even more energetic interactions that would allow scientists to perform different types of experiments and better experiments. So one of the most significant women in the history of the lab was accelerator physicist Helen Edwards. She was hired in 1970, and she was one of the people who oversaw the design, construction, commissioning, and operation of the Tevatron. She had received her PhD from Cornell in 1966. She came to the lab in 1970, and then she eventually became head of the accelerator division. You can see her there at the installation of the final magnet for the Tevatron. And that's an aerial view of that main ring that also held the Tevatron. She did receive a lot of recognition for the important work that she did. She won a MacArthur Genius Grant in 1988, and then she and her colleagues Rich Orr, Dick Lundy, and Alvin Tallestrup all won the 1989 National Medal of Technology for their work on the Tevatron. This is a quote from our previous lab director, noting that it is impossible to overstate her role in making Fermilab what it is today. And then our current lab director, she actually did her PhD work on the Tevatron and was at the lab. And so this is a quote from her in a recent article where she says, Helen Edwards was head of the accelerator division. The Tevatron was being commissioned as a collider. My experience left some indelible marks on my mind. I saw Helen day and night and on weekends. Every single day of the year she was here. She was always monitoring the Tevatron's progress. She was an inspiring and strong leader. And Liam Ramingo returned to the lab in 2018 to lead a project called PIP2 that you'll hear a little bit more about later. And now, of course, she is the lab's director. So to come back to the main thread of the history of the Tevatron, this project, of course, was a large and challenging project. It ran into some issues, and Wilson decided that he wasn't the best person to lead that effort anymore. And so he resigned in 1978, and the central laboratory building was named in his honor in 1980. That's when it became Wilson Hall. But fortunately, the lab was left in the very capable hands of Leon Lederman. I've already mentioned him in connection to Truly National Laboratory, in connection to the discovery of the bottom core. So he had lots of ties to Fermilab. Interestingly, before Fermilab was established, he had done research on neutrinos, and he and his colleagues were the ones that proved that there was more than one type of neutrino, and they eventually won the Nobel Prize for that work. And you'll see neutrinos will end up becoming a much more important part of the lab's scientific program. He was also known for his sense of humor. You can see at that lab event over there, Robert Wilson is wearing a shirt that says founder, and he's wearing a shirt that says flounder. And so he served as director from 1979 to 1989. He was also, in addition to being a skilled scientist and administrator, he was also passionate about science education. And it was under his leadership that the lab became more involved in K-12 education efforts. For instance, the Saturday morning physics program began in 1980. And here he is speaking to one of the first Saturday morning physics classes. This is a program where lab scientists teach physics classes to local students who come on Saturday mornings to the lab and get these really incredible classes with these world-class scientists. So it's really a great program that we still have. And in recognition of all of his work in science education, the lab's Science Education Center was named the Letterman Science Education Center in his honor in 1992. We still have this building at the lab, it's open to the public, and I would definitely encourage you to visit it and bring your kids. There's some fantastic exhibits there and really cool programs that they do. So under Letterman's leadership, the lab continued working on this energy doubler Tevatron project. There was a very important meeting at the lab on November 11th, 1978. It was an all-day meeting that started at 9 a.m. and didn't finish until after midnight. And at this meeting, people at the lab all got together and discussed this idea of potentially doing this energy doubler, of whether they wanted to do a collider or not, and had these very intense discussions, and ultimately made a decision for what the direction of the lab would be going forward. And the decision was that the lab would pursue this doubler plan and would pursue a proton-antiproton collider plan. So the Department of Energy authorized the construction of the Tevatron on July 5th, 1979. It was the world's first superconducting synchrotron, and it was a proton-antiproton collider. It originally used the old main ring to supply the beam of protons, and about 1,000 additional magnets were installed in that tunnel to create the Tevatron. And you can see in this image both the main ring and the Tevatron in that tunnel. So the Tevatron collider was dedicated on October 11th, 1985, and the first collisions were observed just a few days later on October 13th. The Tevatron was a very significant scientific and engineering achievement, and it would be the world's most powerful accelerator for 25 years. These collisions that I've mentioned happened at 2 locations on the ring. There were 2 experiments located at these locations, CDF and D0. And the particles cross paths about 1.7 million times every second at these 2 locations. So just gives you a sense of, you know, the speed that these particles had. And here you can see the detectors themselves, and there's people in both of these images to give you a sense of scale. As you can see, the detectors are physically massive, and then additionally, the collaborations are very large as well. These are group photos of those collaborations, but these photos definitely do not include everybody who was involved in these experiments. At their peak, each of these experiments had well over 500 people. So if you compare that to what you saw with E36 and E288, you can see just how much larger these experiments got over time. So I mentioned that Letterman won the Nobel Prize for his work with neutrinos. That happened in 1988. And shortly after he won the Nobel Prize, he decided to step down as director, and John Peoples became the lab director. So he was director from 89 to 99. He had been with the lab since 1971. He played an important role in the antiproton source for the Tevatron collider, among many other things. And a major scientific milestone for the lab during this time was the discovery of the top quark. So the top quark was a discovery that was enabled by the Tevatron, and it was discovered by CDF and D0. Here you can see the auditorium at the lab packed with people waiting to see this announcement. And this is a representation of those proton-antiproton collisions producing the top quark. And on that standard model, this is the top quark. So this is another part that Fermilab contributed. So just as the seeds of the Tevatron were being discussed before construction even began on the main ring, Fermilab scientists were already thinking about how to improve the Tevatron in the mid-1980s. Initially, the old main ring was used to supply the Tevatron with protons, but a new proton accelerator called the main injector was designed to replace the main ring. So that groundbreaking happened on March 22nd of 1993, and it was completed in 1999. So the main injector is that oval shape that you see alongside the big circle, and it's about 2 miles around, and that accelerator is still in use today as part of our accelerator complex. I'm just going to very briefly mention here, I've been focusing mainly on experiments at the lab using accelerators, but there were other types of experiments going on at the lab. One of these threads I want to mention is astrophysics, particle astrophysics at the lab. So the theoretical astrophysics group was formed in 1983, and it was a very young field at the time. And in this field, scientists use observations of the cosmos to study fundamental particles and forces. And this Lone Digital Sky Survey was one of the lab's first major experiments in this area. I also want to briefly mention here just something kind of a fun fact. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the web was starting in the early 1990s. It was actually started by Tim Berners-Lee at a place called CERN, another accelerator laboratory in near Geneva, Switzerland. And some of the earliest websites, one of the earliest websites was actually at Fermilab, one of the first 3 websites in the United States. And you can see here, this was the lab's very first webpage from 1992. It was the Fermilab Computing Division webpage. So Mike Witherell became the lab's director in 1999, and he was director until 2005. And at that time, I just mentioned CERN. CERN was this European particle physics laboratory, and it was building the Large Hadron Collider. Construction had started in 1998. And the Large Hadron Collider was set to become the world's most powerful accelerator. It would be a superconducting proton-proton collider. And Fermilab was actually quite involved with this effort. Fermilab helped to build some of the magnets that were used in that accelerator. And here you can see a celebration of the first LHC magnet shipment from Fermilab to CERN in May of 2004. But having the LHC on the horizon did mean that Fermilab was going to have to change its direction a little bit. And so one of the things that the lab decided to do was to put a greater focus on studying neutrinos. So this is that standard model again, and this is a representation of neutrinos. So neutrinos are very unusual particles. About 100 trillion of them will pass through you every second, but they're very elusive and difficult to detect because they rarely interact with other matter. They're the most abundant matter particle in the universe, but we know relatively little about them. So to set the stage for this next generation of experiments, the lab built something called the MUNI beam, which stands for neutrinos at the main injector. Work on that began in 2000 and was completed in 2005. And it was built to generate the world's most intense high-energy beam of neutrinos. And it enabled experiments like MINOS, which stands for Main Injector Neutrino Oscillation Search. So one of the things that is interesting about neutrinos is there's several types of neutrinos, and they can transform into one another. And there's lots of interesting information to be found by studying this phenomenon. So MINOS is the first of this type of experiment at the lab called a long baseline neutrino experiment, where basically you create a beam of neutrinos at the lab, you have a mirror detector that looks at the beam there, and then you send the beam a very long distance to a far detector. And the interesting thing about this too is that because neutrinos so rarely interact, you don't need a tunnel or anything for these particles to pass down. They can just go straight through the Earth to your far detector. So MINOS, the groundbreaking happened in 1999, and that was the groundbreaking for the detector hall that held the far detector, which was 450 miles away from Fermilab in northern Minnesota. And here you can see the completed far detector hall. And one of the reasons I like this image is you can see there's this really beautiful mural on the wall, and I think it's just another nice example of how Fermilab has had these connections between art and science. So that experiment started running in 2005, and it finished in 2016. Another major accomplishment of the lab during this time was by the donut experiment, which stands for direct observation of nu tau. And this experiment was the first to directly observe the tau neutrino. And that announcement came on July 21st of 2000. And so here's the standard model again, and there's the tau neutrino. So I'm going to change gears here a little bit. I've talked about a lot of experiments by this point, so you've seen this huge variety of experiments happening at the lab. There's, of course, all these experimental physicists involved in these experiments. And an increasing number of them have been women over the course of the lab's history. This was probably one of the toughest parts of putting together this talk for me, is trying to decide who to feature, because there's so many different people that could be featured. And I've selected some that I thought showed some of the range, but keep in mind that this is just a tiny sample, and there's many other people I could just as easily have featured in here. So one of the people I wanted to highlight was Jean Slaughter. She arrived at the lab as a postdoc in 1973. She worked on CDF among other experiments, but CDF is that one that I just mentioned that helped discover the top quark along with D0. And from the time of her arrival, Jean Slaughter volunteered with many of the lab's educational efforts, and she continued those efforts after her retirement in 2007. And I liked this quote from her, where she said one reason that she started volunteering was to encourage students, especially girls, to consider going into physics, because she said it's important that they can see that physicists are regular people, so they can imagine being a physicist or a scientist themselves. And I think that's very true, and that's something that is still important at the lab, that it's very important. It's just important in general, that if we want to get more people into a field, they need to be able to see people that they can identify with in that field. Gina Remika is another experimental physicist that worked at Fermilab. She came to Fermilab in 1982. She worked on that donut experiment, which I just mentioned, had done the first direct observation of the tau neutrino. She also served as head of the neutrino department from 2005 to 2008. And this was at that time when the lab was really starting to focus more on neutrinos, so it was a very important time period for that work. And then Heidi Schellman, she first came to the lab in 1988. She worked on several experiments, including D0, which along with CDF had discovered the top quark. And she worked on DUNE, the deep underground neutrino experiment, which you'll hear me mention more about in a moment. And this is the latest future generation of these long baseline neutrino experiments like MINOS. And then I also wanted to mention Young-Hee Kim. She was another physicist who was involved with CDF. She had joined CDF in 1990 and ultimately served as co-spokesperson, or in effect co-leader of that experiment. And if you recall, this was a very large experiment, so it was an important leadership position. And she ultimately later served as the lab's deputy director from 2006 to 2013. I also wanted to mention a couple of other interesting people in connection with theoretical physics. We have theoretical physicists at the lab as well. And early in its history, the lab's theory department hosted two women theorists who would go on to have illustrious careers. There was Mary Kay Gaillard, who she was a postdoc at the lab from 1973 to 1974. She did pioneering work in theoretical physics and became a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. And then Shirley Ann Jackson, she was a postdoc at the lab in 1973, and then again from 1975 to 1976. She would go on to hold many leadership positions, including becoming president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And one of the reasons I like to highlight them is they both have come back to the lab to give presentations at the lab. Skyard speaking in 2016, and Shirley Ann Jackson has been back to speak several times. So this is another way in which it's inspiring new generations of physicists at the lab. And currently Marcella Carena is head of the theory department. She came to the lab in 1997 and became head of the theory department in 2015. Women have also played a really important role in computing at the lab. You might remember back in that 1969 directory that I shared, there was a programmer, a woman programmer at the lab at that time. These are a couple other people who played important roles in computing at the lab. There's Ruth Fortes. She was a longtime leader in computing, first came in 1972. She worked on things like data acquisition for the lab's experiments. As you can imagine, these experiments produce huge amounts of data. Data acquisition is an important part of that. She was also involved in some of the lab's early web development. Vicki White first came to the lab as a programmer in 1973. Returned to the lab later, eventually became head of computing, and for a time was the lab's chief operating officer. Engineers, of course, are one of the backbones of the lab. There are a lot of women that are, a growing number of women that are in engineering now, and the lab has a chapter of the Society of Women Engineers. So we have a group called FSWE, which is the Fermilab Society of Women Engineers, which is doing great work at the lab. I've mentioned some of the lab's efforts in education. Some of the people who were influential in that. There was Marge Bardeen, who she began working with the lab's education efforts in 1982. She just retired not that long ago in 2018. She was one of the founders of a group called Fermilab Friends for Science Education, which does a lot of important work to help the lab. Liz Quigg started at the lab in 1974 as an applications programmer and did a lot of web development work for education and outreach. And then last but not least, I wanted to talk a little bit about workforce development. A lot of these roles have been filled by women at the lab over the course of its history. And this, of course, is a very important role at the lab, because if we can't get the best people to work at the lab, we can't do the best science at the lab. So there's Lotta Price Joyner, who was manager of the office in the late 1970s and the 1980s. She developed a lot of the student programs that we have at the lab, especially some of the programs that focus on bringing underrepresented minorities into STEM fields. Diane Engram, she would ultimately become the manager of the office. And she also started some new programs, strengthened the existing programs. So these are also very important aspects of the lab's history. So to come back to the chronological story of the lab, Pierre Donnet became director in 2005. He was director until 2013. And it was shortly after he became director in 2008 that the LHC was completed. When it was completed, it became the world's most powerful accelerator. To give you a sense of scale, if you remember, the Tevatron was over 1,000 magnets, about 4 miles around. The LHC is about 10,000 magnets, about 17 miles around. So very large, very powerful. One of the major experiments at the LHC is something called CMS. It's a little bit like how we had CDF and D0 were collider experiments for the Tevatron. CMS is one of these experiments at the LHC. You can see physically, it's enormous. You can see that little tiny person down at the bottom. I actually was lucky enough in 2018 to get to see this detector in person, and it's really incredible. Like when you're standing there, to me it felt almost like some sort of geological formation or something. Like it's so big. And then the collaboration is very large as well. If you recall, CDF and D0 had over 500 people at their peak. CMS has around 2,600 members the last time I looked, and has a huge number of different institutions involved. So that just gives you a sense of the scale. And part of the reason I'm mentioning CMS in particular is because Fermilab has a lot of involvement with CMS. Fermilab helped construct CMS, and Fermilab provides support for the US-based scientists who work on CMS. And there's about 600 of them. An experiment like this also produces enormous amounts of data, and Fermilab helps process the data from CMS. So shortly after the LHC and CMS and were up and running, the Tevatron was shut down on September 30th, 2011. And you can see Helen Edwards, who had played a key role in the design of the Tevatron, is hitting the switch to shut it down for the last time. It was in the following year, many of you may remember, on July 4th of 2012, the announcement of the Higgs boson discovery. That announcement was made by CMS and Atlas, two of these experiments at the Large Hadron Collider. And Fermilab scientists also played important roles in this, and also Fermilab, of course, is supporting a lot of the scientists involved in the CMS experiment. Just very briefly wanted to mention that work in astrophysics continued. There's the Dark Energy Survey, which started in 2003, began taking its first pictures in 2012, and finished taking data in 2019, but analysis is still ongoing. And I like to mention this one in part just because I like being able to share some of the beautiful pictures that it takes. So those are, if you want to see some of those, you should search that. There's a lot of really nice ones. Nigel Lockyer became the lab's director in 2013, was director until 2022. Fermilab has continued to focus heavily in neutrino physics. I mentioned MINOS, that was a long baseline neutrino experiment. NOVA is the current long baseline neutrino experiment going on. It's currently the lab's flagship neutrino experiment. You can see here the near detector at Fermilab. It's pretty large, but you can see the far detector is even larger. If you see that little person down at the bottom, again, gives you a sense of scale. And so this detector is in Ash River, Minnesota, that far detector. The detectors were completed in 2014. And then looking to the future, the next generation of long baseline neutrino experiment will have there will be the long baseline neutrino facility that will enable DUNE, the deep underground neutrino experiment. This will be an internationally designed, coordinated, and funded program. The near detector, of course, will be at Fermilab. The far detector will actually be at a place called Sanford Research Facility in South Dakota, so it's 800 miles away. And DUNE will help scientists to understand more about neutrinos, which will help them understand fundamental questions like, why is there more matter than antimatter in the universe? Some of these basic types of questions. So the DUNE collaboration officially formed in 2015. The last time I looked, it had over 1,400 collaborators from over 200 different institutions. And so you can see, again, just how this scale of the experiments has really grown over the course of the lab's history. The groundbreaking for LBNF was held at the Sanford Underground Research Facility on July 21st, 2017. They called it an underground breaking because you can see it happened underground. Another important part of the lab's future is PIC2, the Proton Improvement Plan. So if you remember way near the beginning of this presentation, that snowy groundbreaking that you saw for the lab, when the groundbreaking happened for the lab, well, that groundbreaking was specifically for the LINAC, the linear accelerator, the first part of the lab's accelerator complex. And that LINAC is still the same LINAC that is in use at the lab up until today. And it has been upgraded, but it was still the same LINAC. And so PIC2 will replace that original LINAC with a superconducting LINAC. And so just as, for instance, building the Tevatron ushered in a new era of discovery for the lab, PIC2 will also usher in a new era and allow this sort of new generation of experiments. And these are just giving you a little bit of a sense of what PIC2 will look like. And this is really an essential part of the lab's future. It's essential to DUNE. Another really exciting project going on at the lab right now is SQMS, the SQMS Center, which is the Superconducting Quantum Materials and Systems Center. So that was established in 2020 under the leadership of scientist Anna Grassolino. It is one of 5 national centers that have recently been created to advance quantum information science. So quantum computing can solve certain complex problems much faster and more efficiently than traditional computing. And so SQMS is applying Fermilab's technologies and expertise to develop superconducting materials and devices that will allow for more powerful quantum computers. And this has applications for the kind of science done at Fermilab, but it also has applications in many other areas of science and in industry. So it's really a very exciting area. Leah Raminga, of course, became the lab's director in 2022. She's the lab's first woman director, so that was really a big moment for the lab. And today, there's lots of women in important leadership roles at the lab. I won't read all of these, but you can just kind of take a look and get a sense of some of the roles that are played by women at the lab right now. So there's lots of other, experiments and subjects I would have liked to cover. It's always tough in something like this to choose, what to cover and what to leave out. I didn't really get a chance to talk about our muon experiments at all, but there's a lot of exciting work going on there as well. If you want to know more about the lab, I highly recommend taking a look at the lab website. There's all kinds of really great information on there about the science being done at the lab. If you're more interested in just the history of the lab, first of all, I highly recommend this book. One of the authors is my predecessor, Adrienne Cobb. She was the lab archivist beginning in 1983, so she left very big shoes to fill when I arrived in 2012. But this book is really fascinating. It covers the lab's history, mostly up through the discovery of the top quark. I also suggest visiting the history website, history.fnl.gov. We have a lot of historical articles from lab newsletters in there, organized by subject. You can find all the lab's newsletters scanned and searchable, so you can browse through those. And I also have a bibliography here sitting on my coat. I've got 10 copies of additional resources you might want to take a look at if you're interested in the lab's history. If I run out of copies, or if you just would prefer a digital copy, just send me an email and I'll be happy to share that with you. And now I will open it for questions.
Thank you, Val.
Thank you.
Thank you.